Given the gravity of her alleged offenses, I believe that makes her a target.
She might name high-profile Epstein associates.
It's absolutely imperative that the government get this right and safeguard Ms. Maxwell.
Well, it sounds simple, doesn't it? All the US government has to do is keep Ghislaine Maxwell alive until her trial next year. And yet, there are plenty of reasons to believe she may never make it to court. Just consider how easily her ex-boyfriend, Jeffrey Epstein, killed himself in jail almost exactly a year ago. Maxwell's being held at a different detention center in New York, but it still has a terrible reputation, housing all sorts of suspects, including alleged murderers, sex offenders, and terrorists. The fear is that Maxwell, who's accused of grooming young girls to be sexually abused by Epstein, could either kill herself or be attacked by another inmate. Her lawyers worry she might even catch COVID-19. They requested bail on that basis, but bail was denied. In a moment, we'll hear from the jail's former warden, who describes it as one of the worst facilities in the country, and we'll hear from a lawyer who's tackled the mafia, who says even his toughest clients find it absolutely brutal. But first, a quick look at why Ghislaine Maxwell must live to face justice.
Breaking news, a U.S. judge just denied bail for Ghislaine Maxwell, the woman at the center of the Jeffrey Epstein case.
Ghislaine Maxwell will remain behind bars until her trial, scheduled for next July.
Ultimately, a judge said there were no set of conditions that could ensure she would not flee. The risk simply too great.
The judge basically said that Maxwell was too great of a flight risk to be released from the detention center behind me.
The former warden of the prison told the New York Times the MDC was one of the most troubled, if not the most troubled facility in the Bureau of Prisons.
It's gonna be difficult at best.
She's now being monitored closely. Her sheets reportedly taken away, and she's been given paper clothing to wear to prevent any possibility of her harming herself.
Ghislaine Maxwell's impending trial has the potential to be explosive.
So the real currency she has in this system isn't necessarily the cash she could use to flee to the jurisdiction, but it's the information she has.
In this investigation, the prosecutors are going to be looking for anyone that has information about this criminal enterprise that Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein were involved in.
One of the women claims she was forced to have sex with famed defense attorney Alan Dershowitz.
But it was Epstein's relationship with Prince Andrew that sent shockwaves.
Prince Andrew should be panicking at the moment. Because Ghislaine doesn't really care about anyone else but Ghislaine.
Newspapers like the New York Post have made a parlor game of guessing who might be outed by Maxwell, as video recordings might exist.
Could she offer one big name from her little black book and do a deal on that?
No, she can't pick or choose who she would cooperate against. She would have to agree to cooperate against anyone.
Maxwell will remain behind bars, detained across the river from where Epstein infamously killed himself last year.
After what happened with Jeffrey Epstein, they're going to be keeping an eye on her. They're going to make sure, of course, no one can get to her.
Okay, let's bring in our guest now. And Cameron Lindsay was the warden at the jail in Brooklyn, where Ghislaine Maxwell is being held. Ellie Honig is a former prosecutor for the Southern District of New York, the jurisdiction leading the case against Maxwell. And finally, we're joined once again by Lisa Bloom, a lawyer representing a number of alleged victims. Lisa, I'd like to start with you. Before we get into the prison conditions, please just explain to our viewers why Ghislaine Maxwell is so important.
She's important in and of herself because she's accused of conspiring to help Jeffrey Epstein get girls and young women so that he could sexually abuse them. She's accused of sexually abusing them herself, and she's accused of perjury. Most of us representing victims feel that Jeffrey Epstein could not have engaged in sexual abuse at the vast scale that he did without her. She was at the top of his organization, at the top of his pyramid scheme, which brought him so many girls and young women. So she's very important. She's also important because she has a lot of information about other high-profile men who are accused.
And let me ask you something that's being reported in the tabloid newspapers here. Apparently, her friend says that Ghislaine Maxwell is no dummy. She would have made copies of the tapes and of the photographs that Jeffrey Epstein allegedly made of all the comings and goings in all his properties.
Of course, and that's very important. Listen, she's had a lot of time. She had a lot of warning that these charges were coming. She surely could have copied disk drives and photographs and videos and given them to attorneys to hold. So I think we will eventually find out what's going on behind the scenes now, but I'm sure it is high-level negotiations about other people.
Cameron Lindsay, you were the warden in Maxwell's jail from 2007 to 2009. It's been described as a hellhole by some. How would you describe it?
Well, I don't know if I would describe it quite as a hellhole, but it is a very difficult correctional facility. It is a pretrial, pre-sentence facility, so it does operate as a detention center or as jail. But it is a tough place. Because it's an administrative security facility, it houses or detains detainees, inmates, if you will, of all security levels, whether they be minimum, low, medium, or high. So security is paramount there, and it is a very dynamic and complex facility. There are 2 towers that are connected by a tunnel. So it's a very imposing facility as well. Just the high-rise structure of it, smack dab in the middle of Brooklyn. It's a tough place.
And what specifically are the biggest risks to Maxwell inside?
Well, I think certainly she could potentially be a danger to herself, and others are a danger to her. Based on what we've heard thus far, there's just absolutely no question about her high-profile status. It is just absolutely imperative that the government get this right and safeguard her to the greatest degree possible. From my perspective, that means segregating her from all other inmates at all times. It's been rumored that she's had a cellmate at times. I don't know if that's accurate or not. If it is, I would see that as a serious threat to her security. You just can't trust any other inmate to be in a cell with her. Somebody could be paid off to harm her. So 2 things. First of all, she needs to be single-celled from my perspective. She should be single-celled at all times to ensure that no one can assault her. I also believe that she should be under constant and direct supervision at all times. Given the totality and the nature of the Jeffrey Epstein saga, the government has got to get this right. We've got to safeguard her.
Ellie Honig, you were a prosecutor in the Southern District of New York, the exact jurisdiction which is prosecuting Ghislaine Maxwell. What can you do as a prosecutor to make sure that Ghislaine Maxwell makes it to trial?
Well, just from a safety and security standpoint, you have to work with the Bureau of Prisons, people like the warden. It's really primarily solely the responsibility of the Bureau of Prisons. I've certainly had cases where I've called over there and said, hey, I have somebody who has a security concern, but I'd like to do all they can. But I think the steps that the warden just laid out are all A, extreme measures, and B, necessary in this case.
Ellie, she was denied bail because she was deemed a flight risk. Is she actually safer inside jail or inside her house?
Well, she would certainly be safer inside her home. I think any person would, as opposed to inside a federal prison. But I also think it was absolutely the right decision by the Southern District to seek her detention and by the judge to grant it. I don't know that I've ever seen a more obvious risk of flight than Ghislaine Maxwell. This person had been associated with 15 different bank accounts. Why would that be? 3 different passports, had purchased this large spread in a sort of remote area of the country, used a false name to have packages delivered to her, wrapped her cell phone in aluminum foil. I mean, this is a person who, had she gotten a bail, would have been a very serious risk to flee. So I think it was absolutely the right decision to put her in. Now, one consequence of that is it will increase the pressure on Ghislaine Maxwell to cooperate. It's a really, as the warden said, it's a really difficult place for any person to live. Ghislaine Maxwell certainly is not used to this. A lot of the people I used to prosecute had been in and out of jail. She's lived a jet setter, sort of a high living lifestyle up until now. So this has got to be a real culture shock for her. And I think if she's getting good legal advice, her lawyer's telling her your best chance to get out of here as quickly as possible is by cooperating.
Well, I asked the question, would she be safer either in jail or in her own home, because, and not to get too deep into conspiracy theories here, she does apparently have the dirt on a lot of rich and powerful men. It's not beyond the wit of man that she could be, killed outside of jail.
Yeah, look, I don't think I have any real way to know that. I think it certainly seems likely to me that she would have information on some bold-faced names. We know that there have been public associations, photographs of Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell with several prominent people, and not just in business settings, but in party settings. And we know that Ghislaine Maxwell, if she does cooperate the way it works in the Southern District of New York, will have to give up those names, provide other evidence she has against them, and eventually testify against them.
Elisa, one of Ghislaine Maxwell's alleged victims, Annie Farmer, played a part in making sure she was denied bail, and she gave a video statement to the court. Were your clients broadly supportive of ensuring she was not granted bail?
Oh, absolutely. So the 6 Jeffrey Epstein victims who I represent, and one of them has allegations against Ghislaine Maxwell, felt very strongly that she should not get bail. They feel that the criminal justice system has let them down over and over again. Remember, the first women went to the police about Jeffrey Epstein in the 1990s, and they were ignored. And then in the early 2000s, and then they were ignored. And then in 2008, notwithstanding the fact that a number of victims came forward at that point, Jeffrey Epstein got a sweetheart deal that also exonerated his associates, and Ghislaine Maxwell's probably going to use that agreement to try to get off now. Over and over again, in 2019, he was allowed to take his own life in prison, if indeed that's what happened. So the system has to get it right this time. They have yet another chance to get it right, and we are all watching. My victims do not have any faith in the system, given all of these mistakes, at best, mistakes. But we will be watching to see if they get it right this time, and denying her bail was the first step toward that.
Now, for anyone who doubts that Maxwell's safety is even an issue, let me remind you of the apparent suicide of Jeffrey Epstein in very suspicious circumstances. And then we'll hear from a very experienced forensic pathologist who's absolutely sure he didn't kill himself.
A lot went wrong in New York City's Metropolitan Correctional Center during Epstein's time there. So much so that the US Attorney General launched an investigation citing serious irregularities. For starters, Epstein was meant to have a cellmate at all times, but just hours before his death, his cellmate was transferred out and not replaced. Also, Epstein was placed on suicide watch after being found unresponsive with injuries to his neck in late July. But he was taken off the list just 6 days later. Even after being taken off suicide watch, Epstein's cell was meant to be checked every 30 minutes by a guard. But at the time of his death, the guards had fallen asleep and the cell wasn't checked for 3 hours. And while there are no cameras inside the cells, the two placed outside are impossible to check because both of them malfunctioned that night.
Now, New York's chief medical examiner did conclude that Epstein killed himself, but a second pathologist, Michael Baden, hired by Epstein's brother, concluded he had been killed. Baden was working with forensic pathologist Cyril Wecht, who told our program he also believed the evidence pointed to a homicide.
He has a fracture of the hyoid bone. This is a delicate U-shaped bone, the base of which faces anteriorly, located high up in the neck underneath the mandible. And then he has bilateral fractures of the thyroid cartilage, the Adam's apple, one on the right and one on the left. He did not suspend himself. He was what I call a lean into suicide. The body was found with the feet on the ground, the knees down, almost touching the ground, and Epstein leaning forward. You do not get these fractures even in hanging suicides, and certainly not when someone simply leans forward. I believe that Jeffrey Epstein died as a result of homicide, ligature strangulation to be precise, and that it was not a suicide.
Cameron Lindsay, as we mentioned, you were the former warden at the jail housing Ghislaine Maxwell right now. In all your experience, Do you think that Jeffrey Epstein killed himself?
Based on the totality of what I've evaluated regarding Mr. Epstein, I do believe that he committed suicide.
But so many things went wrong that night, as we just heard in that report. The cameras, the guards, and so on. If it was a suicide, what is it about that jail? I understand, it is understaffed, people are underpaid, and actually, there's, it's a very strained facility. Are you saying that is the explanation here?
No, what happened is just 100% unexcusable. It's abysmal that occurred. Not only is it shameful, the allegations against the two correctional officers, but from my perspective, it speaks more to the lack of leadership at the facility, the lack of tone setting that the chief executive has to set. How could you not have more awareness about what's going on with someone like Jeffrey Epstein, who's in your jail?
Lisa and Ellie, do you both believe that that Jeffrey Epstein killed himself in jail?
Well, I have a lot of skepticism because the system has let women down over and over again. And you mean to tell me the camera just happened to not be working 2 weeks after his first suicide attempt? That not just one guard was negligent, but a second guard was also negligent. A guy who has hundreds of millions of dollars, maybe billions of dollars, depending on how well he hit it, who got a break from the criminal justice system over and over again. All of that just happened. I don't really believe in coincidences, and I am very skeptical about whether he took his own life or whether he was killed. And we may never know the answer, but I do know that, once again, the system let women down.
Ellie, your position on this?
Look, I don't have the technical expertise to give an opinion on the cause of death. I think the official finding is clear, and I agree with the warden that there were certainly structural failures at the Bureau of Prisons. I think there were inexcusable lapses regarding the video footage, regarding the guards themselves. And I agree with Lisa that this system writ large has let down these victims time and again. And Jeffrey Epstein's death, whatever the means, and I do believe it was suicide, but Jeffrey Epstein's death was just sort of the capper of that. It was the latest injustice to these victims.
Is there any indication that the justice system, the prison system, has actually learned its lessons, Ellie?
Well, the justice system and the prison system is always learning and will never be perfect. Let me say it that way. Look, I don't think we can afford to give the BOP or the Justice Department any more, let's see how this one goes. I mean, they have to hold on to Ghislaine Maxwell. They have to make sure that she's kept secure and goes through the process. And because that process ultimately is really the last good chance for the victims to get full justice here. If Ghislaine Maxwell comes forward, if she is willing to testify against all the people who were involved in this, I agree with everybody. This was not a one-man show, Jeffrey Epstein. This is not a two-person show, Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. There were many more people involved in this. Ghislaine Maxwell holds the key to figuring out who they were and what they did.
Okay, well, look, we've talked about how Ghislaine Maxwell is the best, chance really to find out what on earth was going on the island, in the mansion in New York, in Florida, and so on. Let's talk about what she would be willing to give to prosecutors and investigators in order to make things easier for herself. Perhaps, Lisa, you could start. What is a plea deal? How does it work?
So 95% of criminal cases end in a plea deal in which a defendant pleads guilty to certain charges, usually lower level charges, in exchange for higher level charges being dismissed. And a sentence is worked out. That's between the prosecution and the defense, and then the judge has to bless it. Sometimes they do, most of the time they do, occasionally they do not. And we just don't have a system where we can bring everybody to trial. We just don't have the resources to do that. Now, many people say Ghislaine Maxwell is going to sing like a bird against other high-profile people and get a get-out-of-jail-free card. I don't agree with that. I think that she, in and of herself, is a high-level person. I think charges were brought against her because we're trying to get justice against her. But I do think that if she has information against other high-profile people, it will help her. It's not going to exonerate her. It's not going to get her completely off the hook, but it will help her.
And Ellie, you've set up plea deals many times in the Southern District of New York. How do you go about approaching a person? And also, are they able to cherry pick whose name they give to you, or do they have to give up everything?
Right. So there are two different kinds of plea deals in the Southern District of New York. The first one is what we would just call a straight no cooperation plea, where somebody says, okay, look, I'm looking at, let's say, 10 years. I'll take a guilty plea for 6 years. Prosecutor agrees. You go into court, plead guilty. That's it. But what I think we're talking about here, I don't think that's likely. I don't think the Southern District is going to have any interest in giving Ghislaine Maxwell a break if she's not willing to testify. The second option is the cooperator plea deal. And the way that works is the potential cooperator, Ghislaine Maxwell, has to come in and tell the Southern District everything she knows. There's no picking or choosing. There's no piecemeal. There's no partway cooperation. It starts with Ghislaine Maxwell herself. The first thing I would say to somebody in that situation is, go back to when you were in high school, the first time you ever stole a candy bar from a convenience store, and then we'll work our way up from there. And you will admit to and plead guilty to everything you've ever done, even if we haven't charged you for it yet. And you have to tell us everything you know that anybody else may have done. So we're going to take your little black book and literally go A to Z, and I'm going to ask you about each of those names, and you're going to tell me what you know, what they did in relation to this operation, and whether you have any other proof against those people. And then the prosecutor has to make a key decision, and Lisa alluded to this, which is it worth it? Is it worth it to give this person a break? And they will get a big break if they cooperate. They don't walk out of jail that day, but they get big breaks, no question. Is it worth it? Typically, you'd be looking to cooperate up the ladder. You'd be looking at the leader. Here, of course, that's Jeffrey Epstein. He's out of play. So the question I would have is it worth giving the person who appears to be the number 2 person a break in order to get other people? And that's going to depend on how much else she has that's reliable and verified and corroborated. If all she can give us is a couple of other sort of marginal fringe players, probably not worth it. But if she can expose, let's say, a dozen or a couple dozen of important, powerful people who committed very serious crimes, then I think as the SDNY, you're interested in that.
Now, Lisa and Ellie, you both would expect her to go for a plea deal and perhaps think it's her best option. But I've actually spoken to a couple of defense lawyers also in Manhattan who have said, why doesn't she just try to beat the rap, as they say? The case is too old. And after all, it is one person's word against another. Lisa, you could start, and then Ellie, I'd like to hear from you.
So it's 3 victims' words against her, plus all the prior bad witnesses, which could be dozens. So let's just be clear about that. But I think the defense strategy will probably be that they will first try to get the case thrown out on some technical legal grounds. One of them is statute of limitations, which are those time deadlines that prosecutors have to file charges. I don't think she has a good argument on statute of limitations grounds, but I'm sure her attorneys, who are very experienced attorneys, I'm sure that they will argue that. The second argument they'll make is that Jeffrey Epstein's non-prosecution agreement signed in 2008, which also exonerates his associates, does not name her, but says including but not limited to, and then a list. They're going to argue that that means that she can't be prosecuted. I don't think they have a good argument there either, but I'm sure that they will assert it. If they win on a motion to dismiss and the whole case is thrown out, then they have won. If they lose, at that point, I would expect the plea bargain discussions to begin in earnest.
Ellie?
Wow, going to trial on this case is a real roll of the dice. Now, does it complicate the trial that the conduct here is 25 and approximately 25 years old? Absolutely. Can you still try a case that's that old and get a conviction? Yes, I've done it. I've done it in murder cases that are nearly that old. You can do it. Can you try a case based on victim testimony? Absolutely. I find I've done that as well. I did a case against 5 people who ran a sex trafficking ring, and virtually all of our witnesses were victims in that case. So if someone's saying Ghislaine Maxwell ought to go to trial here, that's a heavy roll of the dice with somebody else's money, because the vast majority of federal trials result in conviction. And if Ghislaine Maxwell gets convicted at trial, she's done for. I mean, she's 58 years old. She's looking at a statutory max of 35 years. Will she get 35 years even if convicted at trial? Unlikely. Could I see a 12-year, 15-year, 18-year sentence after a trial? Absolutely. So it would be a major risk to go to trial here.
Ellie Honig, Lisa Bloom, and Cameron Lindsay, thank you all for bringing your expertise to the Nexus today. The trial is in July 2021, and there will no doubt be some interesting developments. We'd like to invite you back to discuss those as time goes by. In the meantime, thank you for your contributions. Thank you at home for watching. Remember, you can see this episode and all our previous episodes on our channel on YouTube. Just type in Nexus TRT World. Until next week then, goodbye.